Yeah, done with my Oreo.
Okay, good.
Do you really know what happened?
The brother did.
The brother, that's what I thought too.
I mean, that seems like kind of obvious.
Hey, do you want to talk about death?
Yeah. I mean,
Murdery thingy.
Happy Wednesday.
Happy Wednesday. 2 weeks after the Wednesday that we last talked to you.
Go team. Oh
welcome to Mystery Murdery Thingy as well.
Mystery Murdery Thingy. My name is Chloe.
My name is Mario.
And
welcome to the podcasting closet.
Yes,
yes.
That is correct. We're here to talk about mystery.
And lots of fucking murder. Jesus Christ.
And thingies.
Yes.
Yeah, mine's very murdery. Yours is very murdery this week.
Yes.
I've got a good one.
We're both going to be,
good one.
kind of crazy ones. So I will start, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah. Mario's on the second part of his two-parter, and I'm
Correct.
on the first part of my two-parter.
We've always got it, it seems like at least one two-parter going, right?
I know.
It's funny. So yes, I am continuing the theme from last week, taking, y'all through some murder in Alaska, and this is one that's widely considered the worst mass murder in the history of Alaska, at least in modern times, right?
Oh, wow.
There was this all kind of happens in this small fishing town called Craig, Alaska, which is situated in sort of the southern archipelago of Alaska, right, between Seattle to the south and Anchorage to the north, sort of along the side of British Columbia, right? Just so you're that's where we're talking about. And this was back in the early 80s, specifically September 1982, just at the end of the fishing season, like the last day. And, Craig, Alaska, it's, like I said, a little kind of fishing village, and it's one of those places, you've probably been to these places, like, off-season and on-season, right? It's, like, totally different. So when the fishing season is there, it's
there's
just
a lot of people.
Lots of people. When it's not the season, there's like 500 permanent residents. And it's also one of those places you can only get there by plane or boat. It's one of those as well. So yeah, normally they have one state trooper, a few cops, that's it. Little police department, 3 bars, of course. A restaurant, a church. It's a little tiny town. But, during the fishing season, they sometimes have their hands pretty full. The cops do, with a lot of drunks, rowdy people, fishermen, getting in lots of fights. Apparently there's nothing else to do except to get real drunk. So yeah, it makes sense, right? And on September 5th of 1982, the fisherman Mark Colthurst and his family were enjoying a dinner at the local mainstay restaurant Ruth Ann's, which unfortunately burned down in 2015, but for decades was the restaurant, right, in Craig. And it was not only the end of the fishing season, right, a very strenuous, months-long fishing season that they had been on that they were celebrating the end of, it was also Mark's 28th birthday. And then, tragically, this would be the last time that his family, and 4 of the remaining crew members would be seen alive. Mark and his wife Irene had been high school sweethearts, been together since they were teenagers, and she was there supporting him all the way along his sort of rise in the fishing world. And he was kind of an up-and-comer, right? His rise had not been without struggle, of course. He'd had, failures and he had to work real fucking hard, but it seemed that he and his little burgeoning family were finally on the precipice of that real success that he wanted. He had recently bought a modern kitted out $750,000 fishing vessel, wow. And called it the Investor.
Okay.
Mark
Makes
had,
sense.
and he was very explicit about it. He's like, I'm calling it Investor because this is a big step on my way, but this isn't the end. This is an investment. And he had also become a little bit of a minor celebrity in the fishing world. He had even been featured in a magazine earlier in the year in 1982 as an up-and-coming young, fishing, whatever. I don't know fishing terms, so I'm sorry. Whatever. Real good fishing guy. And he famously vowed to retire by age 50. That was his big thing. Like, I'm just going to work, and then I'm just going to be retired and living off my wealth by the time I'm 50. Didn't end up coming to pass, of course, tragically. And the season of 1982 seemed to have been a pretty successful one for Mark. Like I said, they had been continuously fishing for like 5 months, I think. And the way the boat was set up, they could do different types of fishing, right? They went and fished for like herring, and then they did like Dungeness crab, and they'd like done all this stuff, and they were finally at the end. But, you know, the success, right, monetarily hadn't quite come in yet. Mark was heavily in debt. You know, he had a lot of outlays that, you know, the fishing was going to cover, but he hadn't quite gotten the money yet. He was a bit cash poor, one might say.
Okay.
Reportedly, he even had to borrow $100 from a friend just to afford the meal and the drinks for his birthday dinner that night.
He was kind of waiting on profit, sounds like.
Yeah,
at the moment.
The way it is, you catch the fish and then you have to sell them, right? It's a process. It takes time.
Yeah.
But there was money coming in. And according to a waitress at Ruth Ann's, the night was also marred by an unknown individual who arrived toward the end of the night, argued with Mark, and then kind of left in a huff. And like much about this case, the identity of that person and what they and Mark talked about are completely unknown. And this is really only coming from that waitress, so really... other people substantiate that someone else was there too, but it's not clear exactly what happened. In any case, Mark, Irene, their 2 kids, young kids, and 4 remaining crew members left the restaurant and returned to the Investor about 9:30 p.m. Much of what happened over the next 2 days is, again, hazy, but at some point, all of the 8 people who boarded the Investor that night were killed.
Okay. Oh, God.
According to some eyewitnesses, the killer was seen to clamber onto the ship late on the night of the 5th.
Oh, so they actually saw somebody, like...
Many people saw many things, and
Okay.
we'll get into that.
Okay.
And it's all highly contested. Sometime later, people also reported hearing gunshots. But again, other people reported hearing gunshots like the next day. None of it is totally clear. One witness describes hearing a blood-curdling scream from a woman, and later seeing a shadowy figure debark the Investor and walk down the dock. We'll get back to that later. The next morning, in broad daylight, again, many people saw many things, the killer took the Investor from the dock, and while he was moving it about a mile north to this cove, he actually waved at a passing ship captain, which is pretty crazy. Like, with 8 dead bodies on the ship, he was, like, moving it from the dock, right? And while he was doing that, he saw other people and actually waved at them.
So he's got some balls.
It's pretty crazy. It kind of goes to
Sounds terrible.
profiling, right? It's what kind of person is that, right? So anyway, they moved it to this secluded bay about a mile north, where it lay anchored and actually shrouded in some mist that would happen to be there in mist. It sounds very mysterious, but literally it was shrouded in mist. The killer was seen on several other occasions as well, according to witnesses, who saw a man using the skiff, that is the small powerboat from the Investor. From what authorities extrapolated later, the killer seems to have taken the ship out to the bay, the Investor, and then attempted to sink it by opening these like valves that were down there, which implied that they knew something about the ship, but it didn't work. They thought it would, but it didn't. So it's interesting, right? They knew enough to know what those valves were, but they didn't know enough to know that it wouldn't actually sink the ship. So anyway, it's kind of weird.
Okay. So maybe... Okay.
Yeah, so when that wasn't successful, the killer decided to burn the ship. He returned to Craig and bought gasoline from the local gas station, the one and only gas station in Craig, returned to the ship, and torched it with the 8 bodies decomposing on board. On the morning of September 7th of 1982, the fog around Investor was lifting, but smoke began to rise from the hull. It quickly turned from gray to black and rose miles into the sky. Was seen all around, and vessels quickly started flocking to the scene. First searching for survivors on the deck or in the water, but again, there was none to find. when it became apparent that there were no people around, right, they started searching for ways to put out the fire, which was quickly engulfing this 50-foot-long ship. The skipper of the first ship to arrive, Casino, feared that it was so hot that he feared his propane tanks that he had on board for fuel would explode if he got too close to the fire. Later, a smaller ship came and circled the ship closely to search for survivors. And as the fire continued to grow, it began to melt and collapse part of the ship, which was mainly made of synthetic materials.
Okay.
Like fiberglass.
It was like it was a really, really hot fire? Or?
It was an extremely hot fire, yes.
And do they know what caused it?
Not exactly. I mean, obviously they did a whole arson investigation, but from the moment that the first officer came onto the scene, knew that it was arson. The way that it was burning, how quickly it started, and how quickly it kind of engulfed the ship. It was clearly set intentionally. So at the same time as the fire was really going, right, this Alaska State Trooper named Bob Anderson was on his way. He was kind of the first responding officer to Craig from the nearby town of Klewak to investigate the ship fire. And his first instinct was that this was a case of insurance fraud. That was what he thought first. Perpetrated by, some unsuccessful fisherman to recoup the losses from, presumably some bad fishing season. But, like I said, Trooper Anderson, once he got there, didn't have too much time to ponder that because he saw how quickly the fire was kind of going, right? And tried to figure out how the hell are we going to put this out. The Craig Fire Department and the Forest Service were woefully unprepared for this disaster. They had some pumps, but mostly they didn't work. If they did work, they didn't match the hoses that they had, so weren't any good. He then attempted to commandeer a boat to go and survey the scene himself, but that boat's battery was dead, so he couldn't go. I mean, it's crazy.
This seems like worst case scenario, like bad luck after bad luck.
Yeah, it's like a fucking Steve Martin movie, right? Yeah. So he decides, fuck it, I'm just going to take my personal boat, which luckily was docked right nearby. When Trooper Anderson got to the investor, the fire had intensified even more, engulfing, quote, the entire cabin, bridge, wheelhouse, and galley, as well as the seine net on the stern, close quote. And that's the net that they use to catch the fish, like a big net that kind of juts out from the side, and that's according to Leland Hale from the book that I read. And he couldn't really do anything about this, right? The fire was just going too much. No one could even get close to it. So he watched and kind of pondered as the mast veered and eventually fell into the water. It was at this point it's 5:45 p.m. and the tugboat Andy Head comes to the rescue. Finally, a ship with a working water pump comes, and the Andy Head quickly puts out the fire on the seine net. But the rest of it was decidedly more intractable, and it was not able to be put out with one water pump.
What does intractable mean?
It means ardent, not able to be moved. In this case, not able to be extinguished, right? It's the immovable force of that fire, Eventually, the Coast Guard airlifted pumps in from Ketchikan, I believe.
Oh, wow.
From, like 50 miles away. Another tugboat, the Spruce, attempted to douse the fire by rolling the investor on its side. Bravely, the captain of the Spruce decided he was going to, essentially, push his ship onto this burning ship to push it over so it goes into the water, which is crazy. I mean, Jesus, but... they were fine. Nothing happened to them, but it also didn't work. But it did push the investor closer to the shore. And eventually, when the tide came in, it actually grounded the investor. The turning point in putting out the fire was the arrival of more pumps from the Coast Guard at about 7:30 p.m. These were quickly attached to Andy Head, and the fire was put out, for the most part. At least enough for Trooper Anderson to start really getting close enough to investigate the scene in earnest. And what he saw was essentially a smoldering stack of fiberglass sheets that had collapsed and melted on top of one another. It was a mess. As much of a mess as you can possibly imagine. at 8 p.m., Trooper Anderson began combing through the material by hand, and some other volunteers as well, with wearing heavy gloves and boots, as you can imagine.
I was going to say, that sounds super dangerous.
It's very dangerous, and actually the fire flared up again while they were on the ship, and they had to get some sort of like foam, like firefighting foam, to actually finally really put it out, like, for good, which is crazy. Most of the ship, was just, like I said, this kind of carnage wreck. Eventually, within that wreck, they did discover, tragically, human remains. Most of the remains was burned past the point of recognition. Some of it was not recognizably human, other than the fact that it was apparent, right? Mm. And then some of the other bodies were more or less burned. And you really, obviously, in a moment like that, I mean, what do you say? Like, you find all of these, horrible...
You said 8?
That's what would be established eventually, but even that is fairly contested for a long time. Just how many bodies, the burned human remains represented would actually remain a matter of controversy for many years and become a big sticking point in at least the first trial, as we'll eventually get to. So eventually the families of the victims would be asked to submit dental records so that they could be identified from the teeth that were recovered from the burnt wreck of the Investor. So it really got to that point. Yeah, I know, it just turns your stomach. After night fell in earnest, Trooper Anderson called off the search for that first night and started to go home exhausted. Yeah, understandably. He was interrupted, though, by a policeman telling him that they had found another eyewitness who was leaving town in the morning to go to college and had to talk to them, like, right then. And this was, like, 12:30 at night when this was happening.
Okay.
So according to, again, Leland Hale, the witness told the investigators the following, quote, "The fire had just been announced, and it seemed like everyone was headed out toward the fire, except this skiff. The skiff was headed in the opposite direction toward the dock, and the guy in it seemed like he could care less about the fire," close quote. That witness also told them what the skiff operator looked like, of course, because they were very close. They were within like 10 feet of each other or something. And what he said was a description that would echo in a lot of other eyewitness testimony. A young, white, late teens, early 20s, white man with blonde or brown hair wearing a baseball cap, blue or green.
Sketchy.
And some people say he did look pretty sketchy. Like, he looked like he, was rather disheveled. Other people said the opposite. Again, and you'll find this with all eyewitness testimony. If you get two people to look at the same exact thing at the same exact time, they're not going to give you the same description of it. And that's not even what this is, right? So anyway, in the eventual trials that would ensue, over the many years following this, the eyewitness testimony of one Sue Domanowski would also become critical. She claimed to have actually spoken to the skiff operator just as he arrived from the Investor at the cannery after the fire. According to Sue, he offered her the use of the skiff to go out to the fire, which struck her very oddly, as you can imagine. She said that he appeared to be in shock and generally gave the same description. Trooper Anderson also spoke to a man named Jim Robinson, the owner of Craig Auto, which is that one gas station in town, where the presumed killer had gotten the gasoline just to light the ship on fire, right? And he said he remembered the young man vaguely and did point out his blue baseball cap. Jim Robinson is also going to come back in pretty sensational fashion in the trial, as we'll get to. One witness description of the skipper operator didn't match the others, but just one. That one person described him as a native Alaskan and older, like a man in his middle age. But otherwise everyone pretty much said the same. The one suspect that arose from the initial investigation, and the one that the authorities would eventually come back to, was John Peel, the only real named suspect of any significance in this case. He was picked out by some witnesses as matching their recollection of the skiff operator, and in like photo lineups and different things, although a lot of that is also contested and not entirely clear.
Yeah, we've had this whole eyewitness conversation.
Yeah, eyewitness testimony is not dispositive of anything, at any time. And in fact, one man, Fat Charlie Clark, who had seen the skiff operator, said when police specifically asked him, like pointed and said, is that the man you saw? And they were pointing to John Peel. Said that no, he knows John Peel personally, and that was not the skiff operator. But even that testimony would become contested later too. It's all a mess. Despite the sort of negative identification of Fat Charlie, the investigators decided that they quote unquote liked John Peel for the crime. Right, he was the one they were sort of honing in on.
I don't like that word.
Yeah, I know it's weird when they say that.
I like him.
I know it's funny. Do you like me? Yes or no? He generally matched the description of the unsub, and he knew the investor crew. He knew like all of them personally. He had actually crewed under Mark Colthurst before, and had even dated briefly one of Mark's relatives. John Peel may or may not also have been supplying cannabis to a couple of the investor crew.
The devil's lettuce.
Right. After additional investigation on board the ship and medical examination, and the dental records, etc., it was determined for certain that at least 7 people had died on board the Investor.
Wow.
And the victims at that time that they were, clearly able to establish were Mark and Irene Colthurst, both 28, their children, Kimberly, 5, and John, 4, and their 4 crewmen remaining on the ship, Chris Heyman, 18, Jerome Keown, 19, and Mike Stewart, also 19.
Why? And
it couldn't be established whether Dean Moon, the other crew member's body, was present or not. There just wasn't. The remains were too dispersed. They couldn't find anything that definitively told them that Dean Moon was on the ship.
I'm confused. His kids were on the ship?
Yeah, his wife and kids were both on the ship.
Oh, so they all... Okay.
Yeah, there were 8 people,
Do you think... keep going.
Yeah. So this sort of mystery within the mystery, right, of whether Dean Moon was killed that night would linger on for some time, and would come to shadow the first trial at least. And over the next year, much would remain mysterious as investigators fielded hundreds of calls and tips. They tracked down these tips as far away as Indiana. They talked to, almost 1,000 people, but it did not yield any immediate results. They were still considering the possibility that Dean Moon could have been murdered, or could have been the murderer, but that he had not yet surfaced, right? They were still considering that to be a possibility, but they really weren't sure. Investigators also fielded tips about a possible drug angle to the crimes, which was a theme that would continue to come back in the trials, but nothing was ever proven, really. By March of 1984, the authorities had cycled back to their original suspect, John Peel. They were never able to clearly say why he would have done it, ever.
No.
But there was never any clear motive. But from then on, the Alaskan police and prosecutors were convinced that John Peel was their man. Over the next several years, John Peel would be indicted and tried twice. Indicted twice, tried twice. From the beginning, John has professed his innocence. And in addition to having no clear motive to kill his former boss and 7 other people, he also claimed to have an alibi. He told police he was with his girlfriend the night of the murder. With little physical evidence to go on, police stringently attempted to get a confession, but they were unsuccessful. And eventually John asked for a lawyer. And eventually he brought in a really good defense lawyer named Philip Widener, a larger-than-life figure who would mount a more than vigorous defense of John over the ensuing years, trials, etc. And Widener's first legal victory for John came early. The initial indictment was dismissed by the judge, but only on narrow technical grounds. Quickly, they obtained a second indictment, which stuck, and John was arrested and tried. Yeah.
You said judge, so was it a jury trial?
It was a jury trial.
It was a jury
trial?
trial?
Yeah, good question. At that time, in Alaska, it could have been a jury trial or a judge trial, but it was a jury trial. I believe now, because of Supreme Court precedent, you have to have a jury trial for a murder case, but I'm not totally sure. Widener and prosecuting attorney Marianne Henry, over the 2 trials that followed, would violently and continually battle with each other. Like, it was crazy. From their first opening statements to the close of the second trial, they would object, inveigh, question each other's integrity and intelligence and motives and everything else, and eventually they would both pay restitution for disobeying some of the innumerable orders handed down by each of the 2 judges in these cases.
Oh, wow. So it was like, ooh, it seems really intense.
It was super intense. It was just crazy, and I would truly love to detail every single part of that insanity for you, but we would be here for hours.
We'll talk later.
Read Leland Hale's book. I'm going to go over it in my sources at the end for the full details, and there are lots of them, and he does a great job of writing about them. But I think I can best encapsulate the way that this kind of unfolded by the fact that the judge in the second trial literally went gray during the proceedings. And he was only 45. And his hair turned gray during this trial. And it's not, I think, a coincidence. That's the second trial, which was shorter. The first trial went on for 8 grueling months. The longest trial in Alaskan history up to that point. Dozens of witnesses for each side appeared, and hundreds of exhibits were made. Now, for all of that, there were many unresolved questions at the end of the, when they both rested. The defense had described, the prosecution had described a motive speculating that John had been resentful of Mark's success and peeved that he had been fired by Mark, which John Peel said didn't actually happen. But it was never proved. It was never very well defined. Like, the whole notion of was the weakest part of their case, was the fact that their motive was purely speculation. Whether Dean Moon lived or not had also not been clearly established, even at that time, and this was 2 years later. They still didn't know if Dean Moon had died that night or not. Whether Mark Colthurst was involved in drug dealing was also very much contested. The defense, and this was a lot of the orders the judge made to tell him, like, not to talk about this, and then Widener would just talk about it or find other ways of bringing it up.
Is that legal? Can you get in trouble? You can get in trouble for that, right?
No, he was always getting in trouble during this trial. The judge was constantly bringing them up to the bench. They would go back to his chambers. They would fight about things. He would be like, okay, don't do it again. Like, I can't remember the exact quote, but there's one part, like, end of a chapter in the Leland Hale book where he's like, and the judge finally lost all control over the trial. Like, it was nuts. And although there was never any solid evidence of this whole drug angle, right, other than some testimony from some jailhouse snitches, but it kept coming up in different ways. So in the end, the eyewitness testimony, of course, was key, and few more so than that of Larry Demmer. Larry was terrified to testify at trial, which he said had caused him to develop a dependence on Valium since then. Yeah. Larry was the eyewitness that I mentioned at the beginning, who said that he had seen that shadowy figure go onto and off of the investor and heard the scream. And he claims also that he recognized John Peel as that silhouetted figure. Now, not by seeing his face, but just by recognizing his shape, his mannerisms. Yeah, you can see how Philip Widener would, like, pick this apart on... when Larry Demmer was up on the stand. Now Larry Demmer rather also claimed to have clearly seen John walking along the dock with a rifle in his hand. And that was, through the whole trial, the one and most definitive, time someone was like, I am positive it was John Peel.
You said they were burned beyond recognition. Was there any gunshot wounds?
Yes, there were. That's a good question. There were some that did have visible gunshot wounds. Because there were some bodies that were in a part of the ship that didn't get burned as much.
Okay.
So they do know that, and they recovered some shells as well. But they were never able to. That's a good question. They were never able to clearly establish what the gun was. They think it was a .22 caliber rifle, and they think that it was the gun that Mark had on the ship because he kept a gun on the ship. But they don't know that for sure. They don't know for sure what gun it was. So anyway, the defense attorney Widener also sought to discredit Larry Demmert because of his dependence on Valium and just generally tried to paint him as unbelievable. Most of the other eyewitnesses, all of the other eyewitnesses, were not as sure, that it was John Peel. They would say a lot of things like, well, he definitely looks like him. Like, he looks like him.
It was, okay.
But they never said, yes, that is the man. Crucially, Sue Domanowski, the woman who spoke to the skiff operator, again, she was like that. She was pretty sure it was John Peel, but she was never willing to make that clear, positive identification. And
you said only one person at one time was really, sure?
Right, exactly. And that was Larry Demmert saying, I saw John Peel. I was, this far away from him. He was standing under a light. I was looking through the porthole. I saw him on the dock with a gun in his hand, just after the killings happened. But again, do you believe Larry Demmert or not? This whole case kind of comes down to, do you believe Larry Demmert or not? So the defense's main strategy, other than discrediting him and the other prosecution witnesses, was to establish that John Peel had a solid alibi. Not the one he had initially told the police. That one was a lie. He admitted that. But he said the only reason, according to Widener, that John Peel had lied about that was that his actual alibi was that he was selling someone weed at the time, which he didn't want to admit to the police. Furthermore, the defense produced witnesses that said that they saw John at a bank just after the fire started, and there was also a call that John had made at a time that the defense claims it means it would have been impossible for him to have been the one who set the fire, and therefore the one who was the killer, right? Because again, the fire happened 2 days after the killings happened. As with everything, the timelines were not clear. If you believe the defense, then yes, it was impossible. It's this impossibility defense, right? He could not have been there. But the prosecution says, well, but the timeline could have been this, and this person might have been mistaken. So, anyway.
Yeah, it seems like it all tends to fall apart when it comes to the eyewitnesses.
Right.
That's why the timeline seems so, or if this person was wrong, then it could be this.
Exactly. And there was also this whole sort of issue around quote-unquote Jim Robinson, the owner of the gas station that I had mentioned earlier. Now I say quote-unquote because it became clear that Jim Robinson was not Jim Robinson. That was a pseudonym. That, in fact, the man claiming to be Jim Robinson was a different person who had changed his name to escape justice in Arizona, where he had skipped out on a work camp while serving a sentence for firebombing a car several years earlier.
Oh.
After closing statements, and so that was just another crazy thing that happened during the trial, right? So anyway, after those 8 months had elapsed, right, we're at the closing statements. Even those spanned a few days just for the closing statements. The jury finally began deliberating on August 23rd of 1986, nearly 4 years after the crimes had occurred. On the sixth day of deliberation, the jury advised the judge that they were at an impasse. After speaking with the foreperson, the judge said, yes, I agree, you're not going to be able to come to a decision, and declared a mistrial. Dismissed the jury. Obviously, no one was satisfied with this, right? The state, not the defense, no one, right? But after some prevaricating and some political maneuverings, the state decided to pursue a second trial. After it was discovered that defense counsel Widener had been dating one of the law clerks of the first judge. The
There
prosecution,
it is. Mistrial.
yeah. Well, the mistrial had already happened, but with that, what happened because of that was the prosecution successfully got another judge to say that the original judge was now disqualified, and they had to get another judge to hear the case, and they actually moved to a new venue as well. I think the first trial was in Ketchikan, and the second trial was in Juneau.
This is wild.
Yeah, it's a crazy story. So the second trial was no less contentious than the first, but it was a lot shorter. This was partly because the prosecution streamlined their case. They called fewer witnesses, they had fewer exhibits, things of that nature. But it's also because the defense did not call any witnesses. When the prosecution was done with their case, Philip Widener simply stated, quote, "Based upon the state of the evidence and the burden of proof, the defendant rests his case," close quote. Just felt like we don't even need to do anything. At 3:34 p.m. on the fourth day of deliberations for the second trial, the jury came back with a unanimous verdict. And about an hour later, the world would learn that John Peel had been acquitted on all counts, found not guilty.
There's just too much doubt.
Yeah. There was, in the minds of these people, there simply was reasonable doubt, you know. Widener's instinct, the defense attorney's instinct that the prosecution had not proved their case was correct. In the minds of, you know, the jury, they had simply not proven their case against this person.
So many questions.
And, you know, some of the jurors say, my instinct was he was guilty, but the judge told us you're not allowed to go on your instinct. You have to consider the evidence.
Exactly.
And does the evidence as it's presented prove it beyond a reasonable doubt? That's the only thing you can consider.
Right.
And they said when you really looked at it, no.
Right.
It just didn't.
I've seen 12 Angry Men. I know.
Right. But it wasn't even that in this case. You know, they say that it started out like 8-4 not guilty, and then they convinced the other people. So yeah, the jurors just weren't, and yeah, I think especially to convict him for like this super heinous crime for which you're going to go to jail for the rest of your life.
You can't.
You know,
Have, if it's something like that, you got to be sure.
And it was all just circumstantial, and some of it, like I said, like for the second trial, Mary and Henry actually just flat out admitted, like, we do not know what the motive was. Like, we are not going to establish motive, which obviously hurts your case. If you have to just come out flatly and say, like, one of the three pillars of, like, you know, that everyone knows of how to prove a case, like, we're just going to ignore one of them. And then the other two were, like, only sort of, you know, giving you evidence to substantiate. Obviously, some victims' families remain convinced that John was the true killer, but some others don't. There were actually a couple that met with John Peel many, many years later and were convinced that he was not the killer after speaking to him. Prosecuting attorney Mary Ann Henry, of course, remained until, you know, the day of her death, fervently convinced that the jury got it wrong. This single-minded focus on John Peel, you know, from beginning to way after the end, may also have hurt the prosecutor's case, as some jurors also said that they were convinced by the defense's argument that investigators simply had blinders on from the start. And especially, I think there was a tape of some of the initial, what do you call it, when interviews or whatever, you know.
Interrogations?
The interrogation, exactly, with John Peel, and they listened to that, and they said that for some of them, that's what convinced them. They listened to it, and they said, no, they're just trying to bully him into confessing. Like, I believe him. I believe that when he says that he's not guilty. So, yeah, they just didn't get rid of the doubt. There was still too much doubt. So, as sort of a post-log, the vigorous defense of John from Philip Widener continued after the acquittal even. He continued to represent John and attempted to pry a $177 million restitution from the state of Alaska. Oh. I think $100 million of it was specifically for John. In the end, John would get $900,000 from the state of Alaska as restitution for, you know, whatever, for all of this. 15 years after the crimes in the fall of 1997. And that was sort of the end of it. And it was truly the end of it, because the state of Alaska officially closed the case with the theory that John Peel was indeed the killer and was just not found guilty of the crime.
Wow.
Yeah, and so, I mean, Widener definitely, to him, like Henry, you know, some of these other people, to him, it was actually misconduct that they would go before, you know, the public and say, like, well, the jury got it wrong. We still think he's guilty. I mean, is that really what we want prosecutors to be doing? It does seem like no.
Is that considered misconduct? Like, really?
I don't think so. Not actionable, but I mean, I think you could consider it
Not
inappropriate.
actionable. That makes sense.
The state of Alaska, like I said, officially closed the case. Of course, John Peel continues to profess his innocence and the hope that the true killer will be found so that he can be fully vindicated. Of course, we don't know. Here at Mystery Murdery Thingy, we don't take a position on our mysteries. We talked about doing that. We when we were first formulating the pod, we talked about doing that. But that is the point. We embrace the mystery, and I think this one it's very mysterious. I certainly, if I were on that jury, I'd have a pretty hard time convicting him as well, I think.
Dude, that was rough.
Yeah, that's a crazy one. I mean, when they say it's, you know, the, you know, sort of most heinous, Alaska's worst unsolved mass murder, as it says here on the book, right? So my sources, to get to that, of course, What Happened in Craig, the book by Leland E. Hale, also from 2018, also Johnny Dodd and Adam Carlson at People, Megan Heinz at In Touch, and the Craig, Alaska page on Wikipedia. Wikipedia.
Okay.
And that's my story for this 2 weeks. And I think that's going to be the end of my murder in Alaska. I'll find something else to do next time. Chloe?
Chloe?
Over to you.
So, this is part 1 of 2 of the murder of Athalia Ponsell Lindsley. No, it's not Athalia. It's Athalia. Sorry, I'm learning. Okay, so Athalia Ponsell Lindsley. She was born in Toledo, Ohio. So she was raised by wealthy parents in the Isle of Pines, Cuba, in 1917. So she was somebody who grew up wealthy, was always living a luxurious lifestyle. And I just want to point out, this is a very brutal murder. Quite brutal. A crime of passion, I would say.
This episode is not for the faint of heart.
Not for the faint of heart. So she was raised in the Isle of Pines, Cuba. Later moved with her family to Jacksonville, Florida. So she grew up, she was always a star, right? She was always doing acting. She was active in beauty pageants. After high school, she ended up moving to New York City with her sister and adopted this stage name, Ponsell. And so her and her sister were actually pretty successful. Athalia became a model. She was a model for a lot of like name brand stuff. She promoted shampoo, toothpaste, was in a lot of commercials. She was a Chevy girl.
Oh, really?
She was even in a musical comedy that ran on Broadway for a few weeks in 1942. And she was also a hostess, or like, I think she was the hostess on a game show called Winner Takes All.
Oh, that's cool.
Have you heard of that?
No.
I never have, but she was getting her money, and she was gorgeous, beautiful, tall, bombshell, blonde, absolutely beautiful. She even dated Joseph Kennedy Jr. at one point. I think they were engaged at one point, but I'm not sure. There are some conflicting answers about that. But she was the kind of star that had points in gossip columns. Like, people were like, Athalia Ponsell is currently dating, you know, Joseph Kennedy Jr. and she stars
like,
in blah, blah, blah. And like,
I saw people, I don't remember who it was like some celebrity getting married. And then it was like, I don't remember why I clicked on it, but the beginning of it was like, the guests at the wedding enjoyed this dish and this dish, and like this, and it was like really funny. But
Yeah, very mundane.
yeah,
So, and no, this is 50s, 60s, 70s, right? Once you hit 30 plus, your career as a model kind of yoinks. It's different nowadays, I'd say. But people were still are. It's a very judgmental business. It's difficult to stay relevant especially during that time period.
they're all looking for the new it girl,
Right.
You know, you're not the new it girl if you've been around for 10 years.
Yeah, she also had a kind of reputation as she was, pretty bratty, the bitch of New York. She lost a lot of money at one point, burned a lot of opportunities. And one of my sources was City Confidential, and I mean, it was fine, but it was a little misogynistic. It was annoying. They were like, she got bitter and old and ugly, and she moved to Florida, and it was annoying. But she did move to a white stucco mansion in St. Augustine, Florida in 1972. And it was there that she struggled to fit in, right? So let's talk about St. Augustine, Florida. So this is early 70s, southern Florida beach town, and it's actually one of the oldest in America. I didn't know this. It was founded in 1565 by a Spanish admiral. It's the oldest, populated, living city of European origin in the United States. Lots of tourists, lots of retirees. Rich people everywhere, and there was lots of old historic mansions and Spanish-style houses. It was kind of a mix of rich people, politicians, and socialites, and then on the other side was, the southern, Confederate flag waving, guys in their trucks. So it was actually a pretty dangerous city during the 70s. There was a lot of political tensions that went along with violence. So Athalia she did a little bit of real estate, began selling some real estate. Eventually her license lapsed. She tried to go back to school, but she never really got in the groove. She was an activist. She did dabble in politics. She joined a lot of clubs. She was actually in the DAR at one point, the Daughters of the American Revolution. So at this time in history, like I kind of said before, women had their place, especially in the South, especially in the swamps of frickin' southern Florida. Lindsley, she was outspoken. She did her own thing. She was independent, and people didn't really like that. She was described as intimidating. She was described as having an attitude. Right.
When you're a man, you're assertive. When you're a woman, you're like a bitch. Yeah.
Right. Stirred the pot. Lots of people thought she was a troublemaker, and some people said that she earned her own death. The reaction of the people to her death was, and this is from both City Confidential and the book, and I don't know, it's pretty a subjective thing, but there were definitely people out there who didn't care. She got what was coming, stuff like that. But once you hear what happened, that shit makes me sick. Nobody deserves to be murdered.
Right. Yeah, to be clear, no human being deserves to die. Just to be clear.
So she actually was living with her sick mother, who she was taking care of, Margarita Fetter. She was her caretaker 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Margarita was very elderly, and she even had trouble just getting dressed and going to the bathroom and stuff like that. So she did take care of her until her mother passed. She met James Jinx Lindsley in 1973. So James Lindsley was the former mayor, but his friends described him as a chain smoker who drank too much. He had been married twice before to the same woman named Lillian, who was a dancer. Their son, Danny, died in a motorcycle accident in 1966, and then his wife, Lily, died in a car accident in 71. So that's kind of where he earned his nickname, Jinx.
Oh, okay.
And that was on New Year's Day, 71, and James was actually at the wheel. James and Athalia married only after a few months. They didn't know each other that long before they tied the knot. But they didn't get along that well. There were lots of marital difficulties. Athalia said to her sister Geraldine that James was, quote, a leech and a liar. Geraldine was also the beneficiary to Athalia's will, and James would get nothing. And he didn't even have the key to her house. Like, they actually lived separately. They had some trouble selling Athalia's house, but they also didn't. They kind of clashed. They had even if they did live together, it probably would not have gone well.
Yeah.
And furthermore, they both had some pretty recent difficulties in their life. Like, Athalia's mother died a little bit after the wedding. James had lost the campaign to the county commissioner, and he hadn't lost in decades, so he was kind of down on his luck. And Athalia hadn't worked full-time in years, and James was, at that point, he, lost a resource of income, so they consolidated their income. And like I said, they were both realtors, but the 70s were a really bad time for real estate.
Right.
So there wasn't much income coming there either. Her sister Geraldine said that she didn't talk much about difficulties actually with Lindsley. And it was clear that they did love each other. She was with him every day, skipped work once a week to spend time together. But like I said, James and Athalia did live separately. He lived by the water and she lived on Marine Street, and they fought about property and possessions and lots of bickering. So let's talk about the day of the murder. Picture it. January 23rd, 1974, St. Augustine, Florida.
You stole my thing. You said my thing that I stole from
Sophia.
Sophia, yeah.
Picture it. Sicily. Okay. Athalia Ponsell Lindsley is found dead on her front porch by her neighbors, the McCormicks.
Oh my God.
She was nearly decapitated. She was hacked to death in broad daylight.
What?
Blood everywhere. Out all over the porch, on the walls. She was only wearing one shoe. Her skirt was hiked up. She had severed fingers, defense wounds. She died quickly, according to the autopsy. Her carotid artery was sliced open, severed, bled out. Eventually, a crowd formed. Patty Stanford, a neighbor, heard the screams. She thought someone got run over because Marine Street was actually a pretty busy thoroughfare. Her daughter Patricia thought it was kids playing around. And once police arrived on the scene, Sergeant Dominic Niccolo, he was one of the many officers on the scene. He, along with, what is his name? Deputy Sheriff. I'll get his names in here somewhere. Took over the case. One of the neighbors called James and was like, "Hey, you need to get over here right now." And the police botched the investigation. They messed up the crime scene for sure. The murder weapon wasn't found at the scene. It wasn't at the scene, but it was found at the scene. It was described as a, quote, a crime of just pure hate. People were walking through the yard, climbing over the hedges. Crime scene totally destroyed. People were walking through the house, bloody footprints.
What?
The police officer ordered an ambulance attendant to wash away the blood. Yeah.
What?
Fucked up.
How many times? How many fucking times? And sometimes it's very intentional, of course, but how many times have we seen an investigation where they...
And it's a mystery because...
Come on.
Yeah.
Secure the crime scene.
And then we don't know if it was intentional or not.
True. I mean, when the incompetence gets to that level where you're literally washing away the evidence immediately after you discover the crime, that's pretty,
All three suspects were involved with the city. One was
really?
a police officer. So.
Oh, okay.
And we never know. Richard O. Watson, who eventually became the prosecutor, he commented, he said he was pissed about how the police were handling the case. This was extreme. It is extreme, period. Mm-hmm. But it was also extreme for the town, right? At that time, they didn't even have their own crime scene unit. And they had to call over to Jacksonville. And there was one eyewitness who came forward, 18-year-old Locke McCormick, and he was one of the neighbors. So he described hearing loud, like, snapping sounds. He described it as, like, clapping noises. He saw a white man wearing a white dress shirt and dark slacks, brown gray hair, and he was like, I believe he was upstairs, they're like neighbors, like looking out the window, and he could see like his arm moving up and down, and allegedly he shouted to his mother, quote, "Mr. Stanford is hitting Mrs. Ponsell," unquote. Allegedly. So let's talk about our main man. No, fuck Alan Stanford. Let's talk about Alan Stanford. He was neighbor, county manager, and he showed up around 7 p.m. So when, there's a big crowd, he's like, what's going on? One of his neighbors said, Athalia's dead. He says, was she shot or was she cut?
Jesus.
I know. And like I said, Locke McCormick said it was Mr. Stanford who was hitting Mrs. Ponsell. Walter Arnold, a defense attorney, said the cops looked at one suspect and no one else. But that's... I personally disagree with that. Police records do prove this false. There was actually plenty of follow-up and documentation. So it's kind of interesting when I was listening to the book. They did a lot of interviews, a lot of follow-ups. They went really deep, but they really fucked up the crimes. Yeah. It was... And I think, actually, the St. John's County Sheriff's Office also took over the investigation. So maybe there was more professionalism there. But
and sometimes it can also be like the tension between two investigating agencies when they're trying to decide who has, the right of way.
Right. Yeah.
And sometimes evidence can be, or, different things can happen in that tension. Yeah.
Yeah. Sergeant Dominic Nicolo talked about how, they had to work together. Right. There was no choice. They had to work together. So, obviously there was a lot of error, but they did get a lot of things right. There were over 1,000 pages of interviews and notes and depositions and evidence. Like I said, St. John's County Sheriff's Office showed up. They showed up around 8 o'clock that night to take over the investigation. So here, County Sheriff Dudley Garrett launched street-by-street sweep of the city, interviewed hundreds of people, documented everything. He believed the crime could not happen without bothering others nearby. Right. She was found pretty quickly. And he determined that the murder weapon was a machete because of the depth of the cuts. These cuts were clean and they were long. They started combing through records and they looked at anyone who was arrested with a machete in their possession. Note, and I didn't know that this, I was like, a machete? Oh, you're gonna find the person. It's a fucking machete. No, this is Florida. Lots of people had machetes for trimming palm fronds and vines and bushes. It was a thing. And rumors, they even investigated rumors. The most popular one being that it was James Lindsley and he did it in a drunken rage. James Lindsley did have a violent temper and people really thought that he was capable of killing her. And, they didn't have the greatest relationship. And eventually there was an old machete found in the back of his truck as well. So that day, the timeline of that day. So Athalia went out to eat with James. They were planning on celebrating the Chinese New Year. That day they went shopping together, and then they made plans to meet up again later for dinner. Athalia went home to feed the dogs, and we'll talk about her zoo. I mean, it's not a zoo, but I think she had 2 goats, like
Menagerie.
7 dogs, and there was a blue jay that she was like nursing back to health. So she went out to take care of all of that, and Athalia was seen leaving James's real estate office that day around 5:35 p.m. to go home to feed her dogs and the bird. The plan was to lock up, put a light on in the house to make it seem like someone was home, and head over to James's place. So, James's alibi. He, meanwhile, was at his office, he left his office. 2 eyewitnesses confirmed seeing him leave. He actually spoke to some people before he went over, bought cough drops at the drugstore, spoke to some people. His car was seen there. And then he went to go get some milk. Then he arrived home around 6 o'clock. His neighbor also confirmed that James arrived between 6 and 6:30. There is about 15 to 25 minutes unaccounted for, but it's kind of a stretch, though, to say he, went over, killed his wife, and came back in that time. And he did take a polygraph test, and he passed, but that doesn't really mean anything.
I didn't even mention polygraph in mine because it's so fucking meaningless. It doesn't even,
His stories never varied. Furthermore, so many witnesses saw him that they were all unrelated people that it, didn't make sense for, them to, conspire together to create an alibi. And all in all, the police weren't looking at the husband. Frank Upchurch Jr. was hired to provide defense for another suspect. This one more likely. And his story kept changing. This is County Manager Alan Griffith Stanford Jr. Athalia had an ongoing feud. And when I say feud, a fucking feud. And we're getting into this, okay? He had threatened her life. And there was the trail of blood that was found starting at the front porch where her body ended in the Stanford's backyard. He also borrowed a machete from the town, but he never returned it. And he was identified by Locke McCormick. February 15th, 1974, a little less than a month later, there was a blood-stained plastic bag that was discovered in a swamp near a shipyard. The bag had a watch, a machete, and a pair of blood-soaked trousers in it. The blood on the clothes matched Athalia, and the clothes allegedly belonged to Alan Stanford. The machete was indeed property of the St. Augustine Road and Highway Maintenance, where Stanford actually borrowed materials often. And, he's the county engineer, The department had a certain paint, on that they used on their machetes to identify them that's their property, and that's how they knew that it belonged to the town. But why her neighbor? Why Alan Stanford? So let's talk about this dispute. It began with Athalia's 7 barking dogs howling at all hours of the day and all hours of the night. Note that Marine Street, where she lived, was a loud place anyway. The hospital was right down the street. There were, ambulances in and out. The main street they lived on was busy, thoroughfare cars all the time. There weren't any bushes in between the houses. The houses were pretty close together. Athalia was always the center of gossip. Even then, neighbors joked about her all the time. McCormick and Stanford, the two neighbors, filed a formal complaint in October of 1972. Note that only their side of the story was documented, and they portrayed her as a crazed neighbor who disturbed the peace. She eventually was fined $50, but she never showed up in court. She ended up, in the end, she ended up boarding 4 of her 7 dogs, but the neighbors were still annoyed. Rosemary McCormick initiated a warrant for Athalia's arrest in April of 1973 for not going to court, and that was 3 days before her mother died. And Patty Stanford wrote a long, detailed letter to the police department instead. Athalia went to the husbands. She decided to discredit the husbands, which was weird because it was the wives who were home all day and complaining. There was definitely more behind the dispute between Alan Stanford and Athalia. So it's also possible that Athalia was unwell. She had been taking care of her elderly mother for years. Friends said she looked gaunt in pictures. She was distraught and she was nervous. The day of her death, according to James, Athalia really had to go to the bathroom and was in such a hurry that she left her keys in the door and her groceries on the floor. Geraldine found a tampon in a paper bag in the bathroom trash, which was weird because Athalia was 56. Possible postmenopausal breakthrough bleeding. That's what that could mean, which is very serious. That's a sign of is it ovarian cancer or cancer?
Okay.
Cancer. It's very serious. So yeah, so there was a lot of changes in her life. She moved to a new place, she got married, her mother died, all kinds of stuff. So this dispute went on when Athalia hired someone to cut down a pecan tree between her house and the Stanford's house. Then planted 10-foot-high bamboo on the corner of their driveway, and Patty got the city to remove it as a visual obstruction. Athalia wrote a letter to the commanding officer of the National Guard talking about Colonel McCormick, and no one knows what the letter said, but it couldn't have been a compliment, you know?
Weird.
And she began focusing on Alan Stanford. So, and this is wild. She went to the news office of the St. Augustine Record, got one of the people there to help her dig up records about Alan, but like the rep there like declined. So she left. She was pissed. But eventually she did find plenty of information about Mr. Stanford. She started rumors about him, said that he was getting, or that he was using money for the county for like personal projects. And eventually a prosecutor cleared Alan of that charge. But Alan Stanford wasn't an innocent dude. He was fire happy. He liked firing people. 155% employee turnover. Didn't listen to his employees. Lots of complaints from the workers. They worked 7 days a week, didn't get paid overtime, and people talked about this a lot. The roads in the county were absolutely terrible. Potholes. The book talked about like, and it really, really got into the dispute. The dispute goes pretty deep. I'm not going to get into the details, but the roads were like dangerous, and people complained, and Alan wasn't doing much about it. Wasn't on his radar. Athalia showed up at county meetings, which were open to the public. She showed up at them all the time. And she was loud, and she was ready to fight, and people hated it. In City Confidential, the one commissioner was like, like she wasn't, some of the stuff she said, like, Alan definitely deserved it. I'd probably let her go on for about 10 minutes before I'd cut her off.
Oh my God.
Yeah. He was like, it was crazy, but, like, Alan definitely deserved some of the stuff that she was saying.
Right.
Like, so, yeah, she called out his credentials, noted his ridiculously high salary, which is true. He got a raise, like, way higher than everybody else. And she called him out on it. She called him out, all the time, true bad bitch. She criticized where taxpayer dollars went, like, complained about the streets. Citizens complained about Alan as well. Athalia was at these meetings all the time. Like I said, she wanted Alan fired. She wanted him out. Stanford fought back. He called Athalia a vicious, evil woman and threatened to fix her. Geraldine said that Athalia told her that Stanford actually did threaten to kill her. James, the husband, was also suspicious about Alan. He also had a rep for having a temper. Athalia said that Alan put sugar in her gas tank one time. And James confronted him about it. Like, she was out of town and he poured fucking sugar in her gas tank. Like, how petty is that?
Yeah.
So, the day of the death, January 23rd, 1974, 4:15 p.m., Alan Stanford got 2 visitors from the Florida Department of Professional and Occupational Regulations. These investigators were from the Florida State Board. Athalia had sent a handwritten letter to the director of the board 1 year prior talking about Stanford signing documents as the county engineer, which he was not. He failed the test. So the book kind of goes into this as well. Stanford's father was an engineer, and he tried to follow his footsteps, failed the test, was planning on retaking it, but never did. But he was out here signing documents pretending to be a civil engineer, which is like super illegal. He explained to the investigators, like, there were ongoings between him and Athalia, like, this is a thing that's been going on. Investigators from the board noted that Alan wasn't like super angry or acted like he was going to get revenge. He was almost like too cool for the situation. So like, imagine like some high up execs come in and is like, look, this woman wrote us a letter about you like signing documents illegally. Like, what's going on here? So like, especially if it's someone you've been having a feud with, you'd be like, what? Right. Sorry? Like, she what? Like, you'd think it would inspire some rage, but I mean, we don't know. The state investigators planned on interviewing Athalia the next day, but that night, she was killed. Ironically, on the day of her death, the dogs were locked in the garage, and the police didn't even notice them until they searched the garage. So, eventually, Ellen Stanford was arrested for the murder of Athalia Ponsell Lindsley. But we will get into the trial and its insanity in part 2.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yay!
This was very
that
crazy
was
already.
Short, right? Ooh.
No, not at all.
I guess I could have done it. No, I could have done it in one. There's a lot about the trial, and then spoiler alert: there is a second attack, and we'll get into that as well.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for listening, y'all.
Thank you for listening.
Yeah.
Mario, do you have any weird shit in the news?
No, not
I
really.
know, but I did want to talk about the 39 bodies
Yeah.
that were found in a truck in Essex. What the fuck? I did
know.
retweet it. Everybody go check out the story if you haven't heard of it already.
I read most of the story.
This guy was from Northern Ireland, but they said that the bodies were transferred from Bulgaria.
Well,
Right?
it's unclear. The lorry was registered in Bulgaria,
Okay.
but they don't know if it was actually coming from Bulgaria directly. They have, but I think they're pretty sure that it did. But yeah, it's not clear what actually happened. But the guy was arrested on suspicion of murder. So
39.
yeah, it's just insane.
So my sources were the Wikipedia page, Athalia Ponsell Lindsley, which doesn't have a lot. I feel like I could write up that Wikipedia page. There's a lot out there about it. I was surprised. The book by Elizabeth Randall, Murder in St. Augustine, The Mysterious Death of Athalia Ponsell Lindsley. And I think it was season 3, episode 5 of City Confidential. I think it was called The Politician and the Socialite or something like that.
Something super cliche.
Something cliche.
Yeah, of course. Got to be.
But, wild.
Yeah.
Wild.
Pretty
Absolutely
crazy.
wild.
So yeah, follow our Instagram,
Facebook, Twitter.
Mario Text 30.
Thank you guys so much for listening.
Yeah, thank
we
y'all.
cherish y'all. We are trying to bring some better quality episodes.
Right.
We're doing. I've definitely been reading a lot more books.
Exactly. I read a book for this episode. You're listening to an audiobook. It's what it's about.
Lots of long form articles.
Right.
And I've got so much content now that I reached out to the Reddit community. God bless.
The wonderful resource.
I was like, does anybody where y'all get your long form articles for mystery? Everyone was like, here you go.
Nice.
Bam.
Okay.
And hint.
Oh, what?
I did ask for a long form article on the 1991 yogurt shop murders in Austin, Texas. So stay tuned for.
Long been coming as a topic. I think that's one we've been talking about since before we started doing the pod.
That one is so sad.
Yeah.
It is brutal. It is bizarre. It is a true cold case. Anyway.
Anyway.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.